Welcome back Y&R Spoilers TV. The hospital was supposed to be a place where people were saved, but for Nick it slowly began to feel like a cold maze built out of missing memories and questions that refused to die. The harsh white lights above his bed didn't just expose the damage to his body. They seemed to glare straight into the torn fabric of his mind. After the crash, Nick didn't wake with relief that he was alive. He surfaced into something more unsettling, an eerie suspension between what he knew had happened and what he could no longer reach. He knew something horrific had unfolded. He knew Matt Clark's shadow was threaded through it all. Yet the more he tried to grab the final stretch of the story, the more his fingers closed around air. And that emptiness became the most terrifying thing in the room, because it gave everyone else permission to rewrite the truth in whatever way served them. While Nick, ironically, the victim, became powerless to testify to his own nightmare. Nick's memory wasn't erased completely. He still held the larger pieces, the sense of danger closing in, the feeling of being hunted, the rising tension just before everything shattered. He remembered his heart slamming like an alarm, remembered breath turning into a struggle as if his lungs were being squeezed by an invisible hand. But the ending part that mattered most, the part the police needed and his family clung to, was fogged over like glass, filmed with condensation. Nick couldn't clearly recall how Matt had choked him, couldn't confirm how long the pressure lasted, couldn't reconstruct exactly how he fought back or what Matt's eyes looked like as he did it. Worse, he couldn't answer the question hovering over every conversation like a blade: was the crash an accident, or was it deliberate, an engineered trap meant to silence him and erase evidence? That gap in his recall didn't just slow down his recovery. It dragged him into legal and police trouble, turning his hospital room into a staging ground for interrogations, forms, and repeated questions that felt like hammers tapping at his skull. The police couldn't rely on intuition or on the hatred a powerful family had for Matt. They needed clarity, sequence, detail, a coherent timeline sturdy enough to survive a courtroom. And Nick, the person who should have been the strongest link, had become the weakest. Each time he tried to remember, pain tightened his face, and it wasn't only physical pain. It was the brutal realization that he was disappointing the people who loved him most. He saw fear in their eyes, a fear they tried to hide. If Nick couldn't remember, Matt could slip away. And if Matt slipped away, everything Nick had suffered might be reduced to a tragic accident. Victor was pulled into this spiral in the one way he despised most, through helplessness. Before something he couldn't buy, command, or crush, Victor could bend markets with a phone call, dismantle enemies with a single calculated move, turn negotiations into verdicts. But he couldn't order Nick's brain to remember. Power didn't work on concussion trauma. All Victor could do was stand at his son's bedside and watch a blank space become a crack in the wall protecting the Newman family. In the sterile silence of the hospital corridor, Victor was forced to see what he normally buried under hardness: the fear of losing his child. That fear didn't erupt loudly. It hardened into a sharp, controlled region, internal storm he kept behind his eyes, making every word he spoke sound like it was restraining thunder. For Sharon, the pain took a different shape. She wasn't only afraid of Matt or what he might do next. She was afraid of what Nick would do to himself in the absence of certainty. Sharon understood what it meant to be haunted by something you couldn't prove. She knew what it felt like to drown in details that no one believed without evidence. Watching Nick lying there, alive but not fully present, she felt the most chilling part. A piece of him was still trapped in the last moments he couldn't name. She wanted to be his anchor. Yet she could feel herself being drawn back into a familiar darkness zone defined by dread, by the sense that something bad was on its way, and that the hospital's quiet was only a pause before the nightmare continued. Nick's problems didn't end with what he couldn't remember. His recovery showed signs that made everyone uneasy. A crash didn't only leave bruises and broken bones, it left unpredictable aftershocks. Nick might be clear-headed one moment and suddenly exhausted the next. He might feel a sharp pressure behind his eyes, a pain that suggested something deeper than surface injuries. He might get dizzy when he tried to concentrate too long. Even the most cautious doctors had to confront an unpleasant reality. Some damage doesn't reveal itself immediately, and that possibility thickened the air around Nick's bed. Every small symptom became a warning. Every minor change carried the threat of a post-surgical complication or the fear that a hidden injury had been missed. The slower Nick recovered, the more time became the enemy. The longer he couldn't provide a clear account, the more room there was for doubt to spread. The police, already careful, now had even more reason to question every blind spot. Partial amnesia wasn't only a medical issue, it became a legal vulnerability. It opened the door to dangerous arguments that Nick might be mistaken, that trauma could distort his perception, that he might be projecting fear onto Matt. Everyone knew Nick was the victim, but the law didn't run on compassion. It ran on evidence and consistency. And Nick couldn't guarantee the very thing the system demanded most, consistency. That reality trapped Victor and Sharon in an unbearable position. They weren't just protecting Nick's health, they were protecting his story. One wrong detail could shatter everything. One uncertain answer could be twisted into contradiction. While Nick lay there fighting to remember, Victor and Sharon faced a bitter truth. Sometimes a predator doesn't win through strength, but through Cowsby, leaving the victim unable to speak the full truth. Nick felt that pressure, and it settled on him like an unseen weight. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to see Victor standing in the room, eyes no longer only about control but about worry he refused to admit. He didn't want Sharon tightening herself into composure while fear simmered beneath her calm. Nick tried to reassure them with the resilience everyone associated with him. But he understood the cruelty of his situation. Resilience couldn't replace memory. He could promise he'd heal, but he couldn't promise he'd remember in time. That helplessness became its own form of despair, a quiet sense of being betrayed by his own mind. As the days passed, the questions grew sharper and more suspicious. Nick began to wonder whether his missing memories were purely the result of trauma, or whether fate was playing a sick joke, forcing him to live in a permanent in-between. When he closed his eyes, he hunted for Matt's face in the darkness. But what appeared were fragments, broken sounds, disconnected sensations. The physical memory of being squeezed without the clarity of a man attached to it. The lack of definition made fear mutate. Nick wasn't only afraid of Matt anymore, he was afraid he would never be able to prove what Matt had done. And if he couldn't prove it, would Matt return? Would Matt exploit the silence inside Nick's head, twisting the narrative until Nick looked unstable, unreliable, even guilty? No one had to plant that idea. It grew naturally in the blank space his concussion left behind. Outside the room, the hospital felt different. The corridors still carried the sound of nurses' shoes and machines humming. But now there was another layer, tension, invisible and tight. People spoke softer, moved faster, as if afraid to disturb Nick's fragile state. Yet his fragility wasn't only physical. It was about his position inside the story. A healthy Nick could stand up and fight. A Nick who couldn't remember enough could become a pawn in a battle he hadn't prepared for. Sharon, in the moment she was alone, felt fear rise in waves. The terrifying moments weren't always dramatic events. Sometimes it was the sensation of being watched. Sometimes it was a strange silence after a phone call. Sometimes it was the realization that when Nick was weakest, the enemy had the greatest advantage. Sharon tried not to panic. Panic would only hand Matt a victory, but the more she forced calm, the more she felt as though she were standing on a thin bridge over a deep abyss, refusing to name what waited beneath. Victor reacted the way he always did. The more threatened he felt, the more he tried to control. But the hospital wasn't Newman Enterprises. Here, he had to obey doctors, procedures, limits set by his son's body. His frustration wasn't only directed at Matt. It was directed at reality itself, at how many things he couldn't manipulate. That helplessness sharpened his thinking into a ruthless conclusion. If Nick couldn't remember, Victor would have to find another way to prove the truth. But another way always carried risk, and Sharon understood that. She knew Victor could push everything to a dangerous edge because he believed the Newman family was worth protecting at any cost. With Nick lying there, too weak to defend himself, that edge looked thinner than ever. At the center of it all, Nick could only watch time pass. His body felt like a battlefield where every ache reminded him he'd nearly died. His memory felt like a locked room where the answers existed but the key was missing. His family hovered around him, each carrying their own version of fear. And Nick hated that he couldn't lighten it. He wanted to stand up, to speak the truth, to point at Matt and end the nightmare. But instead, he was forced to heal first, forced to rebuild himself while the world outside refused to wait. In the days that followed, Nick's recovery continued to lag, as though his body were resisting the return to normal. The possibility of a post-surgical complication or an overlooked injury remained in the air, like a threat. Nick hated the uncertainty because it made him feel as though he no longer owned his own life. And within that uncertainty, fear found space to grow. If his health faltered, his memory might recover even more slowly, and if his memory stayed broken, Matt would have more time to spin everything in his favor. Worst of all, Nick couldn't be sure he wasn't holding the wrong fragment. In half-awake moments, he sometimes felt as though he heard a sound right before the crash, or glimpsed an image like a flash of lightning, but when he opened his eyes it dissolved. He didn't know if it was real memory or a mind trying to fill emptiness with imagination. If he guessed wrong, if he offered one incorrect detail, fallout could destroy Victor and Sharon's entire effort. Nick became trapped in a brutal paradox. Silence was dangerous, but speaking incorrectly could be worse. Beyond his bed, tension tightened to the point of snapping. Medicine demanded stability. Nick had to heal, had to rest, had to avoid being pushed too far. The law demanded precision. The story had to be clear, consistent, and delivered in time. Those two demands collided in every decision. Sharon tried to bridge concern and caution, but she felt herself eroding under the weight. Victor couldn't tolerate waiting, but he couldn't force speed. And Nick lay there feeling as though everyone wasn't just protecting him, they were waiting for him to become the answer. Then, in what should have been a small realization, Nick felt something shift. The truth wasn't only in what he remembered. It was in what he couldn't remember. Because the blank space didn't feel random. It was placed perfectly right at the end, right at the moment involving Matt. Right where it mattered most. The question turned ice cold. Was this only concussion damage? Or was it a sign that something about the whole event had been designed to make sure Nick could never tell the full story? Nick didn't have an answer yet. Sharon felt fear moving closer. Victor felt anger harden into determination. The police still needed truth, and time still moved forward, indifferent and cruel. And just as Nick believed he might be close to grasping the missing piece, a new warning sign from his body shifted the mood in the room, reminding everyone that the trouble wasn't over. Nick stared into the blank space inside his own head, listened to the steady rhythm of machines, and understood something that made his skin go cold. The most dangerous part might not be what Matt already did, but what Matt was counting on Nick never remembering. Night settled over the Newman Ranch like a heavy curtain, not only hiding the familiar paths but pressing a suffocating weight onto every thought. A place that once stood for tradition and power now felt like the stage for a bargain so volatile that one wrong beat could ignite a war. Jack understood that the moment. He chose not to let the situation drift into the easy answer of let the police handle it. He wasn't here to simply deliver a fugitive. He was here to force Victor into a position where retreat would be costly, where the Newman name wouldn't be the only thing deciding the outcome, and where the Abbotts could extract a concession that actually mattered. Yet even as Jack told himself he was doing this for Jabbit, for legacy, for survival, he couldn't fully silence the heaviness in his chest, uncomfortable knowledge that he was treating a living, breathing man bound by fear and wrongdoing as leverage, and that looking directly at that truth scratched at his pride. Kyle followed Jack not with the calm of someone executing procedure but with the tight, wired focus of a man walking a high wire. He wasn't naive enough to believe this was a flawless plan, but he also wasn't clear-headed enough to turn back, because once Matt was pulled into this, everything had crossed the line into consequences no one could fully contain. In Kyle's mind, Matt wasn't just a target to be contained. He was a moving risk, a live wire that could spark at any moment, especially if Victor changed his mind. Kyle could see Jack trying to hold the upper hand with strategy and composure. But he also saw the gaps, the openings Victor Newman had made a career out of exploiting. Kyle's real fear wasn't that Victor would reject the deal. His real fear was that Victor would accept it with a cold smile and then twist the entire exchange into a traponi that left the Abbotts looking like kidnappers, blackmailers, or men interfering with justice. Kyle was torn apart by a question that wouldn't shut up. If this imploded, would he be the one who dragged Jack down with him? And would Jabbit pay too high a price for one reckless move? Matt was brought to the Newman Ranch with the help of Abbott security, including the guard who had been tracking him after the accident. Their presence didn't feel theatrical. It felt disciplined and hard-edged, as if everyone understood that one slip of control could turn this trip into a catastrophe. Jack didn't speak much, but his silence wasn't peace, it was tension held so tightly it could snap. He looked at Matt as a living reminder of how quickly things could spiral when a man like Victor had too much power and too many new tools to wield. Matt was proof that violence didn't only exist in fists and strangulation. It also existed in how fear was engineered, how information was steered, how people were pushed to the edge until they made desperate choices. Jack didn't need to like Matt to understand that holding him right now was rare leverage, something Victor wouldn't casually allow to be used against him. But the fact that Matt was leverage made Jack even more aware of how dirty the game felt. He came here because he wanted a deal, and in his mind the offer was almost clean in its logic. Trade Matt for the artificial intelligence program. Jack could frame it as Fireside gives up a man Victor sees as a threat that needs to be contained, a liability that could become a legal and public disaster, a loose end with the power to expose things Victor would rather keep buried. The other side gives up an AI weapon Victor has been gripping like a blade against Jabba's throat, a new kind of power that is invisible, scalable, and nearly impossible to defend against. If Jack could pry that program out of Victor's hands, he wasn't just protecting a company, he was protecting the Abbott legacy itself. In Jack's reasoning, the exchange balanced out. Victor gets control over an immediate hazard, and Jack regains the ability to defend against a long-term strategic threat. The problem was that fair was rarely Victor Newman's language. Victor didn't measure agreements by fairness. He measured them by advantage. The real tension wasn't whether Jack would make the proposal. It was that Jack knew his opponent too well. There was no guarantee Victor would honor anything Jack put on the table. That truth hovered over every meeting between them like a permanent shadow, built from years of Victor nodding and then steering the outcome somewhere darker. Years of Victor agreeing and then crushing the other side with a move that looked legal on paper. Jack wasn't naive enough to trust promises. He only trusted pressure. He only trusted the moment when Victor needed something badly enough to constitute temporary. And Jack was trying to manufacture that moment by bringing Matt to Victor's doorstep. Even imagining Victor's willingness didn't erase the fear that Victor could call the police at any time and hand Matt over properly, flipping the narrative in one stroke, turning Jack from negotiator into someone who overstepped, turning the Abbotts from the party with leverage into the party forced to explain themselves. Kyle felt that fragility more sharply than anyone. He could already see how easily the story could be interpreted, twisted, and reversed with a single phone call. In Kyle's mind, the worst-case scenario wasn't Victor saying no. The worst-case scenario was Victor saying yes with chilling calm, then leaving the Abbotts holding the falloutment gone, the AI program still in Victor's control, and the Abbotts exposed to legal trouble for how they handled it. Kyle wanted to believe Jack had accounted for everything, but Victor always had a way of reading people faster than they read themselves. Kyle understood Victor didn't merely win. Victor made other people destroy themselves while trying to win. Jack, meanwhile, was split down a different fault line. This wasn't only a crossroads between victory and defeat. It was a collision between principle and survival. The principled part of him wanted the straight road, Matt should go to the police, and the process should unfold by the book. But the survival instinct in him, part that had watched Jabbit threatened, the part that had watched Victor use power like a weapon, kept whispering that sometimes, if you want to protect what you love and what you built, you get pulled into the gray. Jack hated the gray, but he hated being pushed against the wall by Victor even more. The offer to trade Matt for the AI program wasn't just a tactic. It was a declaration the Abbotts were done being passive. Even if it scraped his conscience raw, Jack wanted control back at least once. Victor, even before he appeared, was already a pressure in Jack and Kyle's imagination. He was the kind of man who made opponents second-guess themselves before he even entered the room. He didn't need to rush, time usually favored whoever held the most power. And yet Jack's hope lived in the possibility that Victor's greatest strength, absolute confidence, equaled also be a blind spot. Jack knew Victor viewed the AI program as a formidable threat against Jabbit, a tool for prolonged domination. So the real question wasn't would Victor surrender it, but would Victor believe he could eliminate Matt and keep the AI advantage anyway? Victor didn't like giving up weapons. Victor liked collecting them. If Victor agreed, it would almost certainly be because he saw agreement as a stepping stone, not an endpoint, something that bought him time and lowered Jack's guard. That was why the motives stacked on top of one another until the air felt too dense to breathe. Jack wanted a deal to protect Jabbit from a strategic threat. Kyle wanted it to work so he didn't become the reason Jack fell in, so Jabbit didn't bleed out. Because of one risk. Victor, in any plausible version of this, would want to keep ultimate control and never allow anyone to feel they had forced his hand. Matt, even restrained and surrounded, was the match that could light everything. Because if Victor saw another use for Matt, another angle, another benefit deal could twist instantly. Jack knew losing here wasn't only about the AI program. Losing was about posture. If Victor rejected the offer, Jabbit remained under threat, and the Abbotts stayed trapped in defense against something they couldn't control. If Victor accepted and then betrayed them, the Abbotts wouldn't just lose leverage, they'd lose face and lose faith in their own ability to stand against Victor. And if Victor called the police, the whole scene could be reframed as a lawful cleanup, with Jack cast as the man who held someone improperly, and Victor painted as the one who respects justice. Jack hated that possibility not only because it was dangerous, but because it carried humiliation, being taught a lesson by Victor on Victor's own ground. Kyle, by contrast, saw everything through the lens of immediate consequences. He thought about Jabbit's future, about how Victor holding the AI program meant a constant shadow over every business decision, every recovery plan, every strategic move. Victor wouldn't even need to strike right away. He could simply keep the Abbotts aware that a strike was always possible. That suspended thread feeling of being kept on a hook was what Kyle couldn't tolerate. He wanted to cut the line, take back initiative. But every time he convinced himself this was the right path, he was dragged back by the dread that Victor never played by anyone else's rules. This was no ordinary negotiation because it wasn't built on trust. It was built on the total absence of trust. Jack would arrive with conditions. Victor would counter with conditions or with silence that carried calculation. Between those conditions sat the future of Jabbit, the Abbott name. the safety of everyone entangled in the fallout. Jack could argue the trade was fair, but he was arguing fairness to a man who didn't worship fairness. He was trying to sell Victor an idea by using the one thing Victor feared losing: control. And that was the most dangerous game of all, because Victor always converted the fear of losing control into ruthless action. What tightened Jack's chest wasn't only whether Victor would accept. It was what Jack would do to protect himself from the inevitable counterstrike if Victor did accept. Jack couldn't pretend that agreement would mean resolution. With Victor Newman, every agreement was simply the beginning of the next round, a quieter, sharper round where betrayal wasn't an accident but a tactic. Jack forced himself to stay coherent, to stay focused. Not to let years of hostility turn this into an emotional revenge mission. But the colder he tried to be, the more clearly he saw the uncomfortable truth: he was also trying to control Victor. And when two men try to control each other, the winner is usually the one willing to be more ruthless. That was why it wasn't impossible for Victor to make a deal. Victor might see an advantage in reclaiming control of Matt in a way that suited him, avoiding a police process Victor couldn't fully steer, preventing Matt from becoming a loose talking point other forces might exploit. Victor might decide that temporarily giving ground on the AI program was an acceptable price, if he believed he could reclaim advantage later by another method at another time. Victor didn't need sincerity to agree. He only needed agreement to get him closer to what he really wanted. But that possibility of Victor agreeing while already planning to betray was what made Jack's breathing feel too shallow. If Victor nodded with calm confidence, was Jack walking into a trap? Was Jack handing Victor an exit that looked clean and beneficial, while the Abbotts only gained a brief reprieve? Jack hated that he had to think like this, but he had no choice. Facing Victor without anticipating betrayal was suicide. Victor could break a deal and still leave the world believing he hadn't, because he always found a way to shape the story to serve him. Kyle stood beside Jack and felt like he was watching a war without gunfire, where every breath had a blade pressed against it. He wanted to believe Jack wouldn't be outplayed, but he knew Jack was betting on something fragile: necessity. If Victor needed Matt enough, Victor would yield. But if Victor found another way to handle Matt while keeping the AI program, he would pivot instantly. And so Kyle couldn't stop thinking that everything hinged on a single moment and one decision. One expression, one quiet pause from Victor that could change the future of both families. The air at the Newman ranch felt compressed, as if the land itself was waiting to see who would blink first. Jack knew he had to stay clear-headed, keep his goal intact, not let hatred turn the exchange into chaos. Kyle knew he had to keep his fear under control to show no weakness Victor might exploit. Matt sat at the center like a living exhibit with danger and leverage. And Victor, even unseen, was present like a shadow in every thought, a man capable of turning yes into victory, even when he appeared to be conceding. Jack repeated to himself that this was for Jabbett, for the Abbott legacy, for survival. But deeper down, he knew it was also about pride. For too long, the Abbotts had been forced into reaction, forced into defense. If Jack could make Victor surrender the AI program even once, it would carve a mark into their long history of conflict. But if Jack failed, the mark would be carved into him, a reminder that Victor didn't win only through power, but through making opponents confident at the most dangerous moment. And just as Jack told himself he was ready for every outcome, a cold feeling ran down his spine, as if he had finally admitted what he'd been trying not to see. Whether Victor accepted or refused, this was not an ending. It was a threshold. If Victor rejected the offer, the war would move into an open, uglier chapter. If Victor accepted, it would move into something more sophisticated, where betrayal wasn't a possibility but part of the structure. Jack realized he was bringing Matt to the Newman ranch to trade for Jabbett's future. But he was also placing the Abbott family's fate on a gamble where the dealer might not be him. And right before the moment that mattered most, Jack understood the one thing he could never fully control wasn't Victor, wasn't the police, wasn't even the AI program. It was the fact that Victor could smile, nod, take Matt, and in the very same breath turn the entire story in a direction that left Jack with no way back. In this game, only one question truly mattered, and it hung in the air like a blade just before the door opened. If Victor accepts the deal, will he be accepting as a temporary partner or as a man who has just found the perfect way to make the Abbotts the victims of their own move?